The rain was falling so hard that little Amelia could barely see through the windshield. She had been waiting all day for this trip. Her father, Daniel Carter, had promised her the perfect birthday weekend at one of the most luxurious hotels in the city. But when they finally walked through those golden glass doors, soaked from the rain, something unexpected happened. The receptionist looked at Daniel. Then she looked at his daughter. Her smile disappeared. "I'm sorry, sir. We can't give you a room." Daniel slowly pulled out his reservation. "I paid for this room 3 weeks ago." The manager came over. He glanced at Daniel's inexpensive jacket, then at Amelia's little suitcase. And with a cold smile, he said, "Perhaps you should find somewhere more suitable for people like you." Daniel stared at him. "People like me?" The manager didn't answer. Instead, he called security. A few minutes later, Daniel and his 9-year-old daughter were being escorted back into the pouring rain while wealthy guests watched. Amelia squeezed her father's hand. Her voice trembled. "Daddy, why don't they want us here?" Daniel looked down at his daughter, fighting to keep his emotions under control. He had never wanted her to experience the humiliation he had just endured. But what the hotel manager didn't know was this. He had just thrown out the one man who could destroy his entire career. And Daniel was about to discover that what happened to him wasn't an accident. It was part of something much bigger. Something that had been happening inside that hotel for years. And by the time the manager discovered who Daniel really was, it would already be too late. Now let's go back to the beginning. Daniel Carter had spent the last decade building something most people never saw coming from a man who preferred quiet rooms over. He'd grown up watching his mother work 3 jobs to keep their small apartment heated through the winter, and he'd promised himself, even as a teenager, that he would build something that outlasted the hardship he'd known as a child. By his early 30s, that promise had become a hospitality investment firm managing properties across the country. One Daniel had built carefully, methodically, staying almost entirely out of public view. He didn't attend galas. He rarely gave interviews. Photographs of him online were nearly non-existent, a deliberate choice made by a man who'd learned, early in his career, that being underestimated was sometimes the most valuable asset a black. He dressed simply, out of habit more than necessity. A plain jacket, unremarkable shoes, nothing that announced the scale of what he'd built. He drove an ordinary car. He picked his daughter up from school himself whenever his schedule allowed it, standing among the other parents in the pickup line without a single one of them suspecting the truth about who he was. Amelia was 9 years old, curious and bright, with an easy laugh that Daniel would have protected with everything he had. Her birthday was 3 days away, and Daniel had promised her, for weeks, a proper weekend at one of the city's most luxurious hotels, a small extravagance, a rare indulgence. Exactly the kind of gift a father who otherwise lived quietly wanted to give his daughter once a year. He had no idea, driving through the storm that evening with Amelia humming along to the radio beside him, that the hotel he was taking her to was one his own company had quietly acquired 6 months earlier. The acquisition of Blackstone Grand Hospitality Group had been one of the largest deals Daniel's firm had completed, a controlling stake purchased through a private holding structure that hadn't yet been publicly announced. Daniel had insisted on a full internal audit before any announcement, a standard practice for him, born from years of watching companies rush public statements only to discover, months later, problems that should have been caught first. He'd chosen, deliberately, not to visit any of the hotel's properties as its owner just yet. He wanted, for a little while longer, to simply be a guest, someone who could walk through the lobby, evaluate the actual guest experience, and understand exactly what his company had purchased before anyone in that building knew to perform for him. He booked Amelia's birthday weekend 3 weeks in advance, under his own name, the way any ordinary guest would, with no indication anywhere in the reservation system that the man arriving that weekend controlled the company that owned the entire hotel chain. The storm had been building all afternoon by the time they pulled into the hotel's circular drive, rain hammering the windshield so hard that Daniel could barely make out the golden glow of the lobby doors ahead. Amelia bounced excitedly in her seat, her small suitcase, pink, covered in stars, packed days earlier with an enthusiasm only a 9-year-old could sustain, clutched in her lap. Is it going to be as pretty as the pictures, Daddy? Prettier, Daniel said, smiling at her in the rearview mirror. Happy early birthday, sweetheart. Daniel approached the front desk, water still dripping from his jacket, and offered the receptionist a warm, tired smile. Good evening. Reservation under Daniel Carter. The young receptionist, a woman named Ashley, typed his name into the system, her expression shifting almost immediately from polished professionalism into something more uncertain. She glanced at her screen, then at Daniel, then, briefly, at Amelia standing beside him with her star-covered suitcase. I'm sorry, sir, she said carefully. We can't give you a room. Daniel felt the familiar, weary tightening in his chest, a feeling he'd learned to recognize instantly over the years, the specific discomfort of being looked at as a problem before a single word of explanation had. He reached into his jacket and produced his confirmation email, printed and folded carefully in his pocket exactly the way he prepared for any trip. I paid for this room 3 weeks ago, he said calmly, sliding the paper across the counter. Confirmation number's right there. Ashley glanced at the paper, clearly uncomfortable, and picked up the phone at her desk. Let me just get my manager. A few minutes later, a man in an impeccably tailored suit crossed the lobby toward them. Richard Blake, the hotel's general manager, early 50s, silver-gray hair, the kind of practiced composure that came from years of managing wealthy, demanding guests. His eyes moved over Daniel with the swift, assessing glance of a man accustomed to sizing people up in seconds. The plain, rain-soaked jacket, the ordinary, "Good evening," Richard said, his tone carefully neutral, though something colder had already settled behind his eyes. I understand there's a concern with your reservation. There isn't a concern on my end, Daniel said, gesturing to the confirmation still sitting on the counter. I have a paid reservation for tonight and tomorrow night. I'd just like the key to my room. Richard glanced at the paper without really reading it, his gaze drifting back to Daniel's jacket, then to Amelia. A cold, thin smile crossed his face. Perhaps you should find somewhere more suitable for people like you, he said quietly, just loud enough for Daniel to hear clearly, just quiet enough to seem, to any passing guest, like an ordinary conversation. Daniel felt the words land exactly where Richard intended them to. People like me? Daniel repeated. Richard didn't answer. He simply turned, nodded to a nearby security officer, and said, with practiced calm, please assist this guest in leaving the premises. Daniel felt a hot, familiar surge of anger rise in his chest, not at the accusation of some rule violation, because there had been none offered, but at the plain, unmistakable message underneath everything Richard had said and refused to say. He looked down at Amelia, whose excitement had drained completely from her face, replaced by a confused, frightened uncertainty that cut through Daniel far deeper than anything said to him directly. He could have said something. He could have told Richard, in that exact moment, precisely who he was and precisely what mistake was being made. But Amelia was watching, and Daniel had learned, over years of careful, deliberate discipline, that the version of himself his daughter needed to see in this moment wasn't a man proving a point. It was a man's, let's go, sweetheart, he said quietly, taking her hand. The security officer escorted them back through the golden glass doors, out into the pouring rain, past a small cluster of wealthy guests who had gathered near the lobby entrance, watching with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. One guest, phone raised, quietly recorded the entire exchange without either Daniel or Richard noticing. Amelia squeezed her father's hand as they walked back toward the car, rain soaking through both of their jackets within seconds. Daddy, she said, her voice trembling, did we do something wrong? Daniel knelt down in the rain, right there in the parking lot, so he could look his daughter directly in the eyes. No, sweetheart, he said firmly. We didn't do anything wrong. Not one thing. He didn't have the words yet, standing there soaked and furious in the storm, to explain to a 9-year-old exactly what had just happened to them, or exactly what he intended to do about it. But he knew, driving away from that hotel with his daughter's disappointed silence filling the car, that this wasn't something he was simply going to let go. He booked them into a different hotel that night, a smaller, unremarkable property nearby, doing everything he could to salvage what remained of Amelia's birthday weekend, tucking her into bed with a promise that things would be better in the morning. Once she was asleep, Daniel sat alone at the small desk in their room, opened his laptop, and pulled up the internal management portal for Blackstone Grand Hospitality Group, the very hotel that had just thrown him and his daughter out into the rain. He typed in his credentials as majority owner, and for the first time since the acquisition closed 6 months earlier, what he found over the following days went far beyond a single humiliating evening. Then he went further. He pulled guest complaint records going back 3 years, cross-referencing patterns the hotel's own customer service department had apparently never bothered to examine closely. What he found was a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Black guests with confirmed reservations turned away, citing manufactured system errors. Black families charged unexplained additional fees that white guests in comparable rooms were never billed. Guests moved, without explanation, from premium rooms to inferior ones after check-in. Complaints filed by guests and, more troublingly, by the hotel's own employees, quietly closed without investigation, buried in a system that seemed designed specifically to make legitimate concerns disappear. Daniel found employment records showing at least 4 staff members who had formally reported discriminatory treatment over the past 2 years. 3 had been quietly terminated within months of filing their complaints. The 4th, a woman named Renata Cole who had worked in guest relations, had resigned abruptly 18 months earlier, her personnel file oddly incomplete, missing the exit interview that should have accompanied any standard resignation. Something about Renata Cole's file struck Daniel as deliberately, carefully erased. He spent the better part of a week tracking her down, eventually locating her through a professional networking site, now working at a hotel 2 states away. He reached out directly, introducing himself honestly as the new majority owner of Blackstone Grand, explaining what had happened to him and Amelia, and asking, carefully, whether Renata was hesitant at first, understandably cautious after everything she'd already been through. But when Daniel sent her the security footage from his own experience, something in her resolve shifted. "I tried to report this for over a year," she told him, over a call that ran nearly 2 hours. "I documented everything. Guest complaints Richard buried. Employees told to find polite reasons to deny rooms to certain guests. I had files, emails, everything. When I tried to escalate it past Richard directly to corporate, my access to the system was cut off within a week, and I was let go for restructuring less than a month later." "Do you still have any of that documentation?" Daniel asked. "All of it," Renata said. "I backed up everything before they cut my access. I just never had anywhere to actually take it that wouldn't get buried the same way my complaints did." Daniel felt something settle into place, not just anger anymore, but a clear, methodical resolve. He had exactly what he needed now: his own experience, corroborated by years of buried complaints, and a former employee with the documentation to prove exactly how deep the pattern actually ran. 2 weeks after the night he and Amelia were turned away in the rain, Daniel called an emergency executive meeting at Blackstone Grand's corporate offices, informing the hotel's senior leadership only that the new ownership group wished to conduct. He was still settling into his chair when the door opened, and Daniel Carter walked in. Richard's expression shifted in an instant, confusion giving way to a slow, dawning recognition, and then to something closer to dread, as he placed exactly where he'd seen this man before. "You," Richard said, his composed voice cracking slightly. "You're the man you refused a room to 3 weeks ago," Daniel said calmly, taking a seat at the head of the table, "in front of my 9-year-old daughter, on her birthday weekend." Richard's face had gone pale. "Mr. Carter, I had no idea." "I know you didn't," Daniel said. "That's precisely the point." He placed a folder on the table, sliding it toward the center where every executive in the room could see it. 6 months ago, my company completed the acquisition of Blackstone Grand Hospitality Group. I chose not to announce it publicly yet, because I wanted a full internal audit completed before making any changes. I also chose, personally, to visit one of our own properties as an ordinary guest because I wanted to understand exactly what my company had purchased. He let that sentence sit in the silence of the room. What I found, Daniel continued, was considerably worse than I expected. He opened his laptop, connected it to the room's display, and played the security footage from that night. The entire exchange, unedited, from 3 angles, ending with Richard's cold dismissal and the sight of Amelia's frightened, confused face as security led them both back out into the storm. This wasn't an isolated incident, Daniel said, once the footage ended. He pulled up the guest complaint data next, walking the room through 3 years of buried patterns. Black guests turned away, overcharged, downgraded, dismissed, their complaints quietly closed without investigation. Then he introduced Renata Cole's documentation, the emails, the internal messages instructing staff to find polite reasons to deny rooms to certain guests, the record of her own termination less than a month after she'd tried to escalate the pattern past Richard directly. Richard's composure had fully collapsed by that point. I can explain. You had the chance to explain 3 weeks ago, Daniel said, his voice steady, without raising in volume. When I asked you directly what the problem with my reservation actually was. You chose not to answer me then. I'm not particularly interested in an explanation now. Richard, growing increasingly desperate, tried a final deflection. Ashley made the initial decision at the front desk, not me. Ashley was following a protocol you established and enforced, Daniel said flatly. I've already spoken with her. She's cooperating fully with this investigation, and unlike you, she won't be facing any consequences because she was following instructions from management, not making decisions. The room remained in heavy, uncomfortable silence. Effective today, Daniel said, Richard Blake is removed from his position as general manager, pending further legal review related to the pattern of discrimination uncovered in this investigation. Any executive in this room found to have known about this pattern and failed to act will face the same review. 2 additional senior executives, implicated directly in Renata's documentation, were removed within the following weeks. Richard, facing both termination and mounting legal exposure from the multiple guests and former employees now coming forward, saw his career in hospitality management affect. Renata Cole was formally reinstated with back pay and a senior position overseeing the very department that had once pushed her out. The other 3 employees who'd been terminated after reporting discrimination were contacted personally, offered their positions back, and provided with formal, public acknowledgement of what they'd endured. Guests who had been wrongfully turned away or overcharged over the previous 3 years were identified, contacted, and compensated. And across every property in the Blackstone Grand chain, Daniel personally oversaw the implementation of a new anti-discrimination system. Anonymous reporting channels, independent investigators outside the hotel's own management structure, and strict, transparent consequences for any employee found engaging in discriminatory treatment. 3 months later, Daniel brought Amelia back to the same hotel. This time, they walked through the golden glass doors without hesitation, without fear, greeted warmly by a new general manager who knew exactly who Daniel was and had personally overseen every change made. Amelia paused just inside the entrance, glancing around the lobby, memory flickering briefly across her face. Daniel knelt down beside her, the same way he had in the rain-soaked parking lot months earlier. What happened to us wasn't because there was anything wrong with us, he told her gently. Sometimes people judge others because of their own ignorance, sweetheart. Never let someone else's prejudice decide how you see yourself. Amelia considered this for a moment, then smiled, taking her father's hand. Are we staying here for my birthday this time, Daddy? We are, Daniel said, smiling back at her. And this time, nobody's going to tell us we don't belong. They walked together through the lobby, past the same front desk, past the same soaring chandelier, into a hotel that had been forced, through Daniel's quiet, methodical resolve, to finally confront exactly what it had allowed to happen inside its walls for years. Sometimes the people who judge you by your appearance never bother to ask who you actually are. And sometimes the quietest, most unassuming person in the room turns out to be exactly the one with the power to make sure it never happens to anyone else again. If this story reminded you that dignity should never depend on what someone assumes about you at first glance, let me know in the comments. And subscribe, because there's a story just like this one waiting for you next week.